and 4,000 spectators. "Where," he asked his listeners, "shall I begin in opening to your view a character throughout sublime? Shall I speak of his warlike achievements, all springing from obedience to his country's will, all directed to his country's good?" Lee transported them first to the banks of the Monongahela in 1755, to see your youthful Washington supporting, in the dismal hour of Indian victory, the ill-fated Braddock, and saving, by his judgment and by his valor, the remains of a defeated army, pressed by the conquering savage foe. Then he swept them to the high grounds of Boston in 1775, where, to an undisciplined, courageous, and virtuous yeomanry, Washington's presence gave the stability of system and infused the invincibility of love of country. The oratorical journey continued through 1776, past the painful scenes of Long Island, New York Island, and New Jersey, to the precarious fields of Trenton, where deep glooms, unnerving every arm, reigned triumphant through our thinned, worn-down, unaided ranks. There, Washington, self-collected, viewed the tremendous scene. His country called. Unappalled by surrounding dangers, he passed to the hostile shore. He fought. He conquered. Lee took his audience to the lawns of Princeton, the vales of Brandywine, the fields of Germantown, and the plains of Monmouth, building up a heroic image of Washington, the soldier, everywhere present, wants of every kind obstructing, numerous and valiant armies encountering, himself a host. He assuaged our sufferings, limited our privations, and upheld our tottering republic. But his finest laurels had not been won in battle. To the horrid din of war, sweet peace succeeded, and our virtuous chief, mindful only of the public good, in a moment tempting personal aggrandizement, hushed the discontents of growing sedition, and surrendering his power into the hands from which he had received it, converted his sword into a plowshare, teaching an admiring world that, to be truly great, you must be truly good. As president, Washington had laid the foundations of our national policy in the unerring, immutable principles of morality, based on religion, exemplifying the preeminence of free government by all the attributes which win the affections of its citizens, or command the respect of the world. As soldier, as president, and in the humble walks of private life, Washington had been first in war, first in peace, and first in the hearts of his countrymen. Eulogists elsewhere also paid tribute to Washington's virtues in peace as well as war. But in public demonstrations of grief all around the new nation, especially in ceremonial funeral processions, the military elements were foremost. As at Mount Vernon, mourners were led by formations of infantry, cavalry, and artillery in full uniform. Soldiers carried their muskets reversed and pointed to the ground, marching to the mournful cadence of the muffled drums and the dirges played by their company musicians. Army veterans, particularly members of the Society of the Cincinnati that Washington had helped to found, typically served as pallbearers for an empty coffin. And, as at Mount Vernon, civilians, including Freemasons, clergy, civil officials, and private citizens, brought up the rear. Graveside services usually were accompanied by salutes of cannon and musketry, and followed by the erection of martial monuments, before which sentries were placed. The mourning ceremonies were militaristic, partly because Washington died while serving as commander-in-chief of the army during an undeclared war with France. But more than anything else, they marked the passing of the nation's foremost soldier, a man who had spent much of his life at war and won American independence on the battlefield. In retrospect, it was easy for Americans at the beginning of the 19th century to imagine that their nation's founder had been born not a farmer, but a warrior. As a young man, his yearning for battle had led him to the frontier, where his exploits, or mishaps, as a provincial lieutenant colonel, touched off the French and Indian War in 1754. His first experience of battle left him feeling that there was something charming in the sound of the bullet's whine. The next year he tasted defeat with the British Army on the banks of the Monongahela River in western Pennsylvania. Returning to Virginia, he built America's first regular military force, the Virginia Regiment, and led it back to the frontier for a victorious campaign to the Ohio River in 1758. As the French and Indian War ended, Washington returned home to Virginia and a political career in the House of Burgesses, only to re-enter military life in 1775 as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. Then, during the 9 years of the Revolutionary War, he led the army through battle and, what was often worse, the privations of camp, to victory. Wherever his true greatness actually lay, it was to his career as a soldier that people usually turned to remember Washington for the first century and a half after his death. Washington's early biographers focused almost exclusively on his military exploits. Parson Mason Locke Weems started the trend with the publication in 1800 of the first edition of his Life and Memorable Actions of George Washington. An expert storyteller, Weems didn't just recount the cherry tree myth, but expounded on Washington's wartime accomplishments and imagined Napoleon sighing at his military brilliance. He also popularized earlier comparisons of Washington to Cincinnatus, a legendary Roman general who had saved his country and then renounced power to become a simple citizen. Supreme Court Justice John Marshall's 5-volume The Life of George Washington, 1804 to 1807, portrayed Washington as a brilliant tactician, responsible for a series of judicious measures adapted to circumstances which probably saved his country. And another prominent 19th century biographer, the writer Washington Irving, placed General George Washington firmly in the heroic mold. Washington's military life continued to fascinate as America entered the 20th century. General Henry B. Carrington's Washington the Soldier, 1898 and 99, and Thomas G. Frothingham's Washington, Commander-in-Chief, 1930, employed the same heroic but one-dimensional images that had prevailed in the 19th century. Washington standing proudly in the prow of a longboat, crossing the Delaware. Washington on horseback, leading his troops into battle. Washington kneeling in the snow at Valley Forge, praying for deliverance. Washington as Fabius, the crafty Roman general who had worn down Hannibal as he wore down the British by avoiding battle until the moment was right. Yet now there were also critics. Writing in 1930, Rupert Hughes decried the idea of Washington as a kind of bland miracle worker, claiming instead that as a soldier he was infinitely human, incessantly guessing wrong, making innumerable false prophecies, countless mistakes, losing his temper, regaining it, being coerced into defeats and dragged away from them, driven into victories in spite of himself, and driving others to heights they could not otherwise have attained. Other writers picked up on Hughes's lead and dismantled 100 years of legend to uncover a man who was shockingly temperamental, stubborn, impatient, and even foolish. In so doing, they reduced Washington from a hero to an important scamp.